Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I am here today at the James D. Julia Auction House up in Maine, taking a look at some of the guns they're going to be selling in their fall of 2017 firearms auction. What we have here looks a lot like one of those cool Mauser Schnellfeuer pistols, and you know what? That is actually exactly what the manufacturer wanted you to think. This is, in fact, an MM31, a Modelo Militar 31, manufactured by Beistigui Hermanos in Spain. And in fact, Beistigui Hermanos was the first company to make a selective fire, basically version of the Mauser C96 pistol. So the backstory on this, where this came from, was, well, originally Beistigui Hermanos was formed in 1910 by 3 of the 10 Beistigui brothers. And they started, they were a small-scale pistol shop in Eibar in Spain. And like very many of the shops there, they did a little business. They had a handful of employees, not much more than just the 3 brothers. And then World War I happened. And the French came to Spain looking for a source for automatic pistols. They found the Ruby and decided that that would serve their purposes. And they ordered an immense quantity of Ruby automatic pistols. So many that the manufacturers couldn't keep up and had to subcontract out to other little shops in Eibar to actually produce these guns for the French. Beistigui was one of the very first couple of companies that was basically tapped to be a subcontractor to make Ruby pistols for the French. And they did. They made 50,000 or so of them over the course of World War I, and grew the company quite a bit, became very profitable. And then they kind of had a slump after World War I, as again did most of all of the shops in Eibar. All of a sudden there's no longer this huge and continuous demand for pistols. So Beistigui continued to make small handguns, and they found that there was a market for pistols in China. And so they were shipping pistols over, and they did some market research. They sent a guy over to see what was going on and why the Chinese were so interested in pistols. And what they found was this huge interest and demand for the Mauser C96. So Beistigui decided, well, we can make something like that. And they designed their own pistol. Now, the one we'll start with is the Model H. It looks outwardly like a C96, a Broomhandle Mauser, but it's kind of different, has a number of variances. The lockwork's different, has a round bolt instead of a square bolt. It's not just a straight copy. And Beistigui was able to make something like 3,500 of these between 1926 and 28 or so. They sold pretty well, but they realized there was the potential for a lot more. And so in 1928, give or take, they introduced a full auto or a selective fire version of the Model H. And that proved to be immensely popular. By the end of 1929, they'd manufactured 22,000 of these things, sold them all in China. There was a voracious appetite for these pistols in China at the time. There had been an international arms embargo put down on China, but it didn't include machine pistols. And so those were a very popular type of firearm to get. The period of huge demand for these machine pistols in China only lasted about 5 years or so. By the early 1930s, by like 1932, this demand had pretty much been extinguished, and we'll get to why in a few minutes. But over the course of these couple of years, Beistigui was one of the forerunners in trying to improve their guns and make them more interesting to that Chinese market. So in early 1930, they introduced a new model that they called the MM31, the Modelo Militar 31. And this is an MM31, although this is the last version of it. The MM31 started out as basically a selective fire Broomhandle Mauser look-alike, and it's a really, really close look-alike. From the outside, they're virtually identical. However, Beistigui actually has a number of improvements to the lockwork that do make it a more efficient gun to produce. It's interesting, while Beistigui used a whole bunch of really kind of slimy tricks, they tried to make their logos as similar as possible to Mauser logos. They wanted people to mistake their guns for Mausers, there's no doubt about it. However, they weren't bad guns. In fact, they were legitimately very good machine pistols that could have competed against Mauser just on their merits. However, Beistigui probably recognized that the mass market in China was it was easier to market to an existing prejudice in favor of Mauser than to try and convince people that Beistigui guns were better than Mausers. So they just did that. They just put their hooks into the Mauser bandwagon and rode it as well as they could. Now, they actually did it better than Mauser. Mauser wouldn't introduce a machine pistol into China until 1931, really kind of at the tail end of this whole market. Beistigui had theirs in 1930, and they would continue to improve it. So the first models were selective fire but had fixed 10-round magazines. They had a second model where they expanded that to a 20-round fixed magazine, give you a little more firepower. These things fire at like 900 rounds a minute. So a 10-round fixed magazine goes away really quickly. 20-round fixed mag was better, but really obnoxious to load. So they came up with a third variation, which used detachable box magazines. Now they only made just a small number of these before about 1931, when Mauser started importing its own Schnellfeuer pistols into China, which were also select fire machine pistols using detachable box magazines. Beistigui, being on top of their game, recognized what Mauser was doing, and they immediately redesigned their magazine well to fit Mauser detachable magazines. Not just, on the one hand, this is good for the Chinese consumer because it means the magazines they're getting from Mauser will also now work in these guns as well. Of course, from Beistigui's point of view, they wanted to continue this muddling of the brands, making people mistake their guns for Mausers. And so what we have here is the fourth variation of Beistigui's MM31, which uses Mauser detachable box magazines. Still fires at about 900 rounds a minute. We've got a selector switch over here. In fact, why don't I show you that up close? The earlier versions of these guns had a number of different markings on them. They went under a couple of different patent or trademark names. Royal was probably the most common. Beistigui owned the Royal trademark, and that was a trademark that had a big fan following in China. So that was a very successful marketing device of theirs. They would then introduce an MM31 marking on these guns in 1930 or 31. However, by the fourth model, they pretty much had no markings left on them except for the very basics. And we can see those here on the right side. Those three marks are kind of the standard triad of Spanish pre-World War II proof marks. The H there is actually a year code, and that indicates that this one was made in 1935. This is definitely at the very end of production. The market had really slowed down by this point. We have a couple little things here. This is obviously not the original grip, and it's got some custom hand checkering, and someone's put their initials into it on this side. And 1947 on the left side. No idea what that specifically indicates. It kind of got that EPV, those initials there as well. We do have the selector here on the left side, so falls nicely under the thumb, assuming you are right-handed. R is for rapid, N is for normal. So that's semi-auto, that's full auto. We have a serial number up here on the top of the barrel extension. That's 31648. These would go to about 31,800, so this is almost the very end of the production. You will find the last three digits of the serial number on a couple other pieces, like the bolt there, 643, and the locking block there, also 643. Now the stock on this is mismatched. That's a 300,000 serial number. I believe the stock here is actually the stock from a Mauser C96. It will fit this gun as long as you don't have a magazine in it. And as long as you have the hammer down. So that's how this thing was designed to be carried. When Beistigui made these, what they did was actually route out a slot here in the stock to give you space for the magazine to stick out. Same thing for the 20-round fixed magazine guns. And then they had a leather boot that covered that. So made it a little bit less quick and handy to get the gun out of this holster, but it did also allow them to basically use the standard holsters they already had. Beistigui would make two different sizes of magazine, 10-rounders and 20-rounders, and as I mentioned before, these are interchangeable with Mauser Schnellfeuer mags. So that was good for the Chinese. That's also kind of a cool thing for today's collector or shooter, because it means it's much easier to find magazines that will fit this late MM31 because Mauser magazines fit. Now looking at this from the outside, you can see that is extremely similar to the Mauser C96. In fact, even for the fairly advanced collector today, if you weren't able to see the markings, you'd be very hard-pressed to differentiate this. However, it's not actually quite the same internally. Let me show you. So to take this apart, we're going to cock the hammer, and then we lift up on this disassembly button, and then we can slide the frame off. So for comparison, here is a large ring, actual legit C96 Mauser, and here we have the Beistigui gun. You can see a number of the pieces are a little bit different. There are some subtle differences in here. The biggest difference is in the locking block. So if I take this off, I can pull that down, we have this extra piece that comes out, and this is the locking block. So it's going to sit here, and it's going to pivot up and down slightly. It will pivot down when the barrel assembly, or the barrel extension, comes backward. And when it does pivot down, these two locking lugs disengage from those two locking lugs, and they allow the bolt to open. The Beistigui gun here works on the same principle. However, it has this locking block actually pinned to the upper receiver so that it doesn't come out as a separate piece. That's actually a clever, I would call it a clever improvement in the design. And there are a couple of other things like this that Beistigui did that are legitimate improvements to the Mauser C96 design. So it's an interesting case of a gun where they did make it mechanically, objectively better, but they also engaged in some pretty kind of underhanded marketing tactics that you would normally associate with a company that was making an inferior product. So clearly not a straight copy here. This is different, and Beistigui did patent some of their improvements in Spain. Unfortunately for Beistigui and the other Spanish manufacturers, the gravy train of machine pistols in China kind of ended by about 1932 for a number of different reasons. So in 1930, kind of the warlord Civil War period, or the warlord period of the Civil War in China came to an end, and things started to really coagulate into nationalists and communists, and both sides started to try and consolidate and standardize their arms, and that had a negative impact on the import of all sorts of oddball guns like these things from Spain. At the same time, in 1931, the Spanish king, Alfonso XIII, abdicated. They were starting to see a lot of civil unrest in Spain, which would grow into the Spanish Civil War, and the Spanish government started to enact some much more stringent regulation on the manufacture of arms. And so that kind of put the kibosh on machine pistol manufacturing for a little while in Spain. So the guns, you've got less of a market, the restrictions on their manufacture are growing. Also in 1932, the Japanese start military actions in China, and a lot of these guns, probably most of these guns, were being imported by way of Japan. So European companies would ship to Japanese trading companies that they were fairly well connected with, and then the Japanese traders would actually bring the guns into mainland China, it being much easier for the Japanese to work with the Chinese than Europeans in Germany or Spain to try and bridge the cultural divide and market directly in China. That worked really well until the Japanese invaded China, and then the Japanese government pretty much shut down the import of firearms into China, all loopholes of international arms regulation aside. So by 32, this has pretty much come to an end. This was, of course, the last model, the last version of Beistigui's machine pistol, and they only made about 1,000 of them. So in total, Beistigui made right about 32,000 broom handle type clones. The majority of them were fully automatic, including this one. But this really is the final development iteration of the gun from Beistigui. In light of these changes to both the market in Spain and the market in China, companies would have to adapt and overcome. In Beistigui's case, what they did was transition to manufacturing bicycles much more than guns, so that would keep them in business. Star, Astra, all had the same problems. Even Mauser had the same issues, really. Spanish machine pistols like this are really quite scarce today in the United States in all their different models, but this one in particular. If you would like to get one in your own collection, well, you don't have a whole lot of opportunities to do so, but this is certainly one of them. If you take a look at the description text below, you'll find a link to the James Julia catalog page on this gun. You can take a look at their description and photos and provenance and all that good stuff. And if you're interested, place a bid on the phone, on the net, or come here and participate in the auction live. Thanks for watching.